The morning Irene Bell threw a bucket of cold well water over Sheriff Dunbar's boots for suggesting she ought to smile more, the whole town of Caldwell, Kansas decided once, and for all that she was beyond saving. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell was a cattle town sitting right on the edge of the Kisham Trail, a place where the dust never fully settled and the air always smelled of leather, horse sweat, and ambition. It was a town built by hard men who believed hard things about the world, and the hardest thing any of them believed was that a woman who spoke her mind was a woman who had something wrong with her. Irene Bell was 26 years old, and she had something wrong with her by every account the men of Caldwell kept. She ran the general store on Main Street, the same store her father, Thomas Bell, had opened 18 years ago and handed over to her 2 years back when his heart gave out quietly one Tuesday morning. Thomas Bell had been a fair man, a man who loved his daughter's sharp tongue and taught her the books himself, who showed her how to read a ledger and haggle with suppliers and never, ever let anyone convince her that a good price was charity. When he died, he left her the store, the small house attached behind it, a mule named Clarence, and a reputation as the most stubborn woman in Sumner County. She wore that reputation the way other women wore Sunday hats. She refused to extend credit to men she knew would not pay. She would not lower prices because someone's wife batted her eyelashes at her. She kept the store open the hours she chose and closed it on Wednesdays because Wednesday was the day she did her accounts and she would not be interrupted. She hired a young Cheyenne woman named Nara, who had been turned away from every other position in town, and when people complained, Irene told them they were welcome to shop at the dry goods in the next county if they liked. She did not attend church socials. She did not bake pies for the town fundraiser. She did not simper or flutter or pretend that the concerns of men were automatically more important than her own. She wore her dark brown hair pinned up but not fussed over, and her dresses were practical and clean but never fashionable, and when men looked at her the way men sometimes looked at unattended women, she looked right back at them until they found somewhere else to direct their eyes. She had been courted 3 times and had refused all 3 times. The first man, a land agent named Patterson, had told her she would need to hand the store over to him once they married. She had shown him the door. The second, a cattle buyer from Wichita, had told her she was handsome enough that he was willing to overlook her personality. She had told him she was not willing to overlook his. The third had simply assumed one afternoon that because she was a woman alone she would not mind being kissed without asking. He had found out that she minded very much and that the hand she used to swing a cast iron measuring weight was stronger than he had expected. After that, the men of Caldwell mostly left her alone. They talked about her naturally. She was difficult, they said. She was cold. She was proud. She was the kind of woman who would die old and alone because she had no softness in her, no give. They said these things over whiskey at the Long Branch Saloon and over fence posts and over Sunday dinners, and they believed them sincerely, because it is easy to believe that a person who refuses to accommodate you is broken. Irene heard the talk. She always heard the talk. She set her jaw and kept her books balanced and her shelves stocked, and she did not let it touch the deep, private part of her that sometimes wondered if they were right. She was lonely. She knew she was lonely. But loneliness had never seemed sufficient reason to accept a lesser life, and every man who had come to her had offered precisely that. A lesser life, dressed up in the language of rescue. She had stopped waiting to be rescued sometime around age 22. What she had not stopped was hoping, in a very small, very quiet way, that somewhere in the world there existed a man who would not require her to be smaller than she was. She had, however, given up expecting to find him in Caldwell. That was before Orville Hadley rode in on a gray horse with a cracked saddle and a canvas sack of goods he needed replenished, on a bright April morning when the cattle drives were just beginning to push north up the trail. He was not remarkable to look at, not in the way the dime novels described handsome men. He was 30 years old, lean and sun-darkened the way trail men were, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that was 3 weeks past respectable. He had a long, quiet face with gray eyes that held their own counsel, and his hands were the kind of hands that had done real work, calloused and sure. He wore his hat pushed back slightly, not for style but because he had a habit of reading the sky and the hat was in the way, and he wore a brown duster that had been rained on enough times to acquire a character of its own. He was a trail hand and an independent scout. He worked the cattle drives north but had spent the last year working further west, mapping water sources for a land survey company based out of Dodge City. He was not a rich man and did not pretend to be. He was not a famous man and did not want to be. He was simply a man who had spent a very long time in wide open spaces and had developed a comfortable relationship with his own silence. He came into the Bell General Store on that April morning with a list written in a careful, even hand on a piece of folded paper, and he waited at the counter without fidgeting, which was one of the first things Irene noticed about him. Most men who came in treated the waiting like an offense. They shuffled and sighed and drummed their fingers. Orville Hadley stood at the counter and looked at the shelves with the patient interest of a man who found the world genuinely interesting. "Good morning," Irene said, coming from the back room with her apron on and her mind still half in the accounts she had been running. "What do you need?" He set the paper on the counter. "All of that if you have it. And if you are short on anything, I would rather know now than find a gap in the sack 3 miles out." She picked up the list and read it. It was a sensible list. Flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, a small amount of hardtack, cartridges in a specific caliber, a length of rope, 2 candles, nothing extravagant, nothing foolish. "I have all of it," she said. "Give me a few minutes." She began pulling items from shelves, and he did not talk while she worked, which was another thing she noticed. Men who came in alone usually tried to fill the silence with conversation, most of it directed at her in ways she found tedious. He stood quietly and watched the street through the front window as if he had not a single thing to prove. She set the items on the counter and tallied the total. $1.40, she said. He reached into his vest pocket and put exact change on the counter. She looked at the coins and then looked at him. "You counted that before you came in," she said. "I had a fair idea of the prices," he said. "Your prices are posted in the window. Most men don't read them. Most men figure they can talk a woman down," he said, with a mild evenness that contained no particular heat. "I prefer not to waste either of our time." She began packaging his items. She did not know exactly why she said what she said next, because she was not in the habit of making conversation with trail men, but something about his straightforwardness opened a door she usually kept shut. "You are heading west," she said, "southwest eventually, following the Medicine Lodge River for a survey. I have got about 4 weeks of territory to cover." He watched her wrap the candles in paper. "You pack carefully." "I wrap things the way I would want them wrapped if I were the one carrying them." He looked at her then, a direct, quiet look. "That is a good practice." "Most people do not think to have one," she said, and heard the edge in her own voice, the little bristle that crept in when she was being inadvertently personal, and she smoothed it out. "Will that be all?" "One more thing." He reached into the sack on his shoulder and pulled out a small, battered pocket watch. The cover was bent and the clasp was broken. "Is there anywhere in town that does watch repair?" She hesitated. "Abel Marsh does at the smithy, but he is not delicate with small mechanisms. Your watch is more likely to come out worse than it goes in." "You know a better option." She should not have said what she said. She would think about that later, turning it over. "My father taught me. I have his tools in the back. I could look at it, but I would want to know what happened to the clasp before I tried to fix it." He placed the watch on the counter between them. "It took a fall onto River Rock about 3 weeks ago. The face is intact, the movement seems to be running, but the cover does not close." She picked it up. She opened what remained of the clasp and examined the hinge. The pin had bent and the small spring plate beneath it had cracked. She could see it clearly. It was not a complicated repair, not beyond what she had done before. "I can fix this," she said. "It would take me about an hour. Do you have time to wait, or do you need to be moving?" He looked at her with those quiet gray eyes. "I can wait." She fixed the watch. He sat on the barrel she used as a waiting seat near the window, and he read a newspaper she had on the counter, a copy of the Caldwell commercial from the week before. He read it attentively, turning the pages without noise, and when Nara came in from the back with a crate of new inventory, he stood up briefly and nodded to her in a way that was simply respectful, nothing more and nothing less. And Nara looked at Irene with slightly raised eyebrows, which Irene ignored. The repair took 50 minutes. She brought the watch back out and set it on the counter and showed him where she had replaced the spring plate with a piece of brass cut from a similar mechanism she kept in a small parts tin, and how she had straightened the hinge pin with a fine jeweler's hammer. "The cover should close cleanly now," she said. "Be careful with river crossings." He closed the cover and opened it twice, feeling the click of the clasp. Then he looked at her, and the look was warm and genuine, not the performative gratitude men sometimes offered when they wanted something, but simply real. "What do I owe you?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "It was 20 minutes of real work and 30 minutes of patience." "Then let me at least say that you do excellent work, miss." He stopped because he had not gotten her name. "Bell," she said. "Irene Bell. Orville Hadley." He extended his hand and she shook it because she always shook hands. It was how her father had taught her to do business, and his hand was dry and the grip was firm without making a point of it. "Safe travels, Mr. Hadley," she said. "Thank you, Miss Bell," he said, and he picked up his sack and walked out into the April morning, and she watched him mount the gray horse and ride south down Main Street without looking back, and she stood at the counter for a moment longer than she usually stood after a customer left. Then she went back to her accounts. He came back 9 days later. She was in the middle of an argument with a rancher named Gus Waverly, who believed that the price of tobacco had gone up purely out of her personal spite toward him. And she was explaining with controlled patience that the price of tobacco had gone up because the supplier in Wichita had raised his wholesale price, and she was not in the business of selling goods below what she paid for them, regardless of who was buying. Gus Waverly was a large man with a large opinion of himself, and he was in the middle of saying that, in his experience, women who ran businesses didn't truly understand the economics of commerce, when the bell above the door rang and Orville Hadley walked in. He took in the situation in one sweep of those gray eyes, the way a man who had spent years reading terrain read it, and he went to the far end of the counter and waited, examining a display of small pocket knives with the absorption of a man who had all the time in the world. "As I was saying," Irene said to Gus Waverly, drawing his attention back, "the price is what the price is. You are welcome to send to Wichita directly if you believe you can find it cheaper. The freight cost alone will settle the argument in my favor." Gus Waverly bought his tobacco and left in the manner of a man who felt he had been cheated without being able to prove it, and the door swung shut behind him. "Bad morning?" Orville Hadley asked, setting the pocket knives back. "Standard morning," she said. "Were you not heading southwest?" "I was," he said. "I got about 12 miles down and found a problem. My map is wrong." He reached into his duster and produced a rolled piece of paper, a survey map with penciled notations. "The creek marked here does not exist anymore. The whole bed has shifted. I need to recalculate my route and I am missing a reference. Someone told me at the camp. I passed that there was a man in Caldwell who had done survey work along the Medicine Lodge about 15 years back." "Abner Cross," she said immediately. "He lives on the north side of town, the white house with the green shutters. He is old and his eyesight is poor, but his memory is intact and he kept all his original notes." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "He was a friend of my father's. He comes in every Thursday to buy coffee and biscuit flour. We talk." She paused. "I also helped him organize his papers last winter. He was worried about them and had no one else to do it." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something confirmed something he had already thought. Would you be willing to come with me? I imagine he would be more likely to show me the notes if you introduced me." She almost said no automatically. But she was not too proud to notice that the request was reasonable and that it was the kind of request that came from practical sense, not manipulation. "I close for an hour at noon," she said. "I can take you then if you have time to wait." He did. They walked to Abner Cross's house in the noon light, and Abner Cross was delighted to see Irene and pleasantly curious about Orville. And he brought out a whole box of survey notes tied in string, and spent the better part of an hour and a half pointing at maps and explaining water source shifts, while Orville asked careful, intelligent questions and Irene sat in the corner chair and ate the shortbread cookies Abner's housekeeper brought out and listened to two men who genuinely knew their geography talk about it. She noticed that Orville Hadley spoke to the old man the same way he had spoken to her, without condescension, without hurry, with the complete attention of a person who understood that knowledge was knowledge regardless of where it lived. On the walk back, the afternoon had turned warm and the cattle pens on the south end of town were singing with their usual noise and dust, and Orville walked beside her at a pace that matched hers rather than his own, which was a small thing but registered. "You have lived here all your life?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "My father came from Ohio in 1855. He built the store when I was 6 years old. I have been in it ever since." "Do you like it, the town?" She considered the question honestly. "I like what I have built here, the town itself, and I have an understanding." She paused. "It tolerates me. I tolerate it." "That is more complicated than a yes," he said. "It is a more complicated question than it sounds," she said. He was quiet for a moment and they turned onto Main Street, and then he said, "In my experience, the people a town tolerates are usually the most interesting people in it." She did not look at him when he said that, but she felt something shift, something small and cautious, like a door opening the smallest fraction. "And in my experience," she said, "that kind of observation is either the truth or a very good way of saying something a woman wants to hear." "Both can be true at the same time," he said mildly. She stopped in front of the store and turned to look at him, full on, the way she looked at everyone when she wanted to take their real measure. He looked back. He did not flinch and he did not posture. He just looked at her the way she looked at him, two people taking an honest reading of each other. "I will give you the benefit of the doubt on which one it is," she said. "For now." He smiled, and it changed his face considerably, made it warmer and less contained. "I appreciate that." She went inside. She did not think about him for the rest of the afternoon, or she tried not to, and she managed it about 60% of the time. He stayed in Caldwell 3 more days before heading out on his survey route. In those 3 days he came into the store twice for small things, and both times they talked. Not the way she talked with customers, efficiently and at the surface, but the way she talked with Abner Cross or with Nara, the way she talked when she forgot to be careful. They talked about the geography of the territory and the movement of the cattle drives, and what it meant that the railroad was pushing through, and whether Caldwell would survive the changes it was bringing. He had opinions but held them lightly, and when she disagreed with something he said, he did not redden or stiffen. He considered what she said, and sometimes revised his opinion, and sometimes did not, but either way with the dignity of a man who understood that thinking was a process and not a verdict. On the morning of the 3rd day, before he rode out, he came in one last time with a small, wrapped paper package that he set on the counter. "What is this?" she said. "Something I found in the saddlebag from a trip to Dodge City last fall," he said. "It is a book. I thought you might want it." She opened it. It was a well-worn copy of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a novel she had read once years ago in her father's library and had wanted to read again since. She looked up at him. "How did you know I would want this?" she said. "I didn't," he said honestly. "But you have read everything on your lending shelf twice, based on the wear on the spines, and this is the kind of book a person who has read everything available would want next." She held the book and looked at him, and the small, cautious thing inside her opened another fraction. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it without armor around the words. "I will be back through in 4 weeks," he said, picking up his hat from the counter where he had set it. "I hope you enjoy it." He walked out. She turned the book over in her hands. Nara appeared from behind the curtain that led to the back room and looked at the book and then at Irene and said nothing, which was very expressive for a person who said nothing. "He is passing through," Irene said. Nara went back to stocking shelves. Irene put the book behind the counter and spent the rest of the day being approximately 40% as efficient as she usually was, and the whole 4 weeks he was gone she thought about him in small, careful doses, the way you look at the sun, just enough and then away. The 4 weeks were eventful, as they always were in a cattle town in spring. A drive of 3,000 longhorns came through, which meant the town swelled and the saloons roared, and the store was mobbed with cowboys buying tobacco and ammunition, and hard candy in quantities that kept Irene and Nara busy from open to close. A dispute between two ranchers over a water right escalated into a confrontation outside the sheriff's office, and Irene watched from her doorway as Sheriff Dunbar handled it with the combination of law and strategic patience that was, she would freely admit, his actual gift, whatever his opinions about women and smiling. A young woman from one of the farms outside town came in asking for something that Irene understood without it being said, and Irene sent Nara out on an errand and quietly told the young woman what she needed to know, because her mother would have expected her to, and her father had always said that real helpfulness required real courage. She read Frankenstein in the evenings after closing, sitting in the chair by the east window with the lamp turned up, and she thought, as she read it, that Orville Hadley was an interesting man for having thought of it. She thought about the kind of mind that catalogues the people it meets carefully enough to give them the right book. She wondered what book he would have thought to give himself. He came back on the 31st day, which was 3 days later than 4 weeks exactly, and she noticed she had noticed, and chose to find that merely informative rather than significant. He looked dustier and tireder, and there was a healing cut on his left hand from a fall he made briefly reference to, and his horse, he explained, had thrown a shoe about 7 miles out, and he had walked the last stretch rather than risk the animal's leg. He was not complaining when he said any of this. It was simply the account of what had happened, offered because she had asked how the survey had gone. They were sitting, this time, because she had offered him coffee and the small table near the back where she sometimes ate her noon meal, and he had accepted with the ease of a man who understood hospitality when it was genuinely offered. "Did you find the water sources?" she asked. "Better than I expected," he said. "The old creek bed Abner Cross noted became a reliable alternative route. The land company will be pleased." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "How were the drives through?" "Enormous," she said. "I sold everything twice over, had to wire Wichita for resupply. It arrived on time, which is something." "You manage the supply chain yourself." "I manage everything myself," she said, and it came out with a little too much weight, a little of the exhaustion she kept packaged and stored. She pulled it back. "It suits me." He looked at her steadily. "You are allowed to find it tiring as well," he said. "The two are not mutually exclusive." She looked at him. No one had said that to her before. People either admired her autonomy as an abstraction or quietly waited for her to fail. They did not simply acknowledge that managing everything alone had a cost. "How long do you stay in Caldwell this time?" she asked, because the question was easier than responding to what he had said. "That depends," he said. "On what?" He looked at her with those gray eyes and said, with the careful honesty she was beginning to understand was simply his nature, "On whether I have reason to stay longer." The silence after that was a particular kind of silence, the kind with content. "I think," she said finally, and her voice was even but something in her chest was not, "that Caldwell has more to offer than it is usually given credit for." "I think so too," he said. He stayed a week. In that week, they took the noon hour together twice more, and once he came by after closing and she made biscuits on the small stove in the back and they ate them with preserved peach jam and talked until the lamp burned low. He told her about his family, a mother in Missouri who wrote letters he answered faithfully, a brother who had gone to California, a father who had died when Orville was 17 and left him the choice between a farm that couldn't sustain itself and the wide open land of the West. He had chosen the West without regret, though he carried the farm with him in certain ways, the careful attention to resources, the respect for what the earth could and could not give. She told him things she told almost nobody. About her father and the smell of sawdust and ink that had meant home for her whole life. About the loneliness that she framed always as independence, because the reframe was protective even if it was not entirely honest. About the morning 2 years ago when she had found her father in his chair and understood from the stillness that he was gone, and how she had sat with him for an hour before she called for the doctor, because she needed that hour to say goodbye properly. "I am sorry," Orville said quietly when she said that. Not the reflexive sorry that people offered, but the kind that acknowledged the weight of what she had carried and was still carrying. "He left me everything I needed to survive," she said. "I cannot be sorry about how it ended. I can only be sorry it ended." He nodded. They sat in the quiet of the store after hours, with the lamp making its warm circle and the night sounds of Caldwell coming in through the slightly open back window, and it was one of the most comfortable silences Irene Bell had ever been in with another person. On the 7th day, he told her he had been offered another survey contract, this time along the Cimarron River, and he needed to give an answer. They were standing outside the store in the early evening, the sky going pink and orange in the west the way Kansas skies did when they really committed to a sunset. "Are you going to take it?" she asked. "I am considering the alternatives," he said. "What alternatives?" He turned to look at her, and the sunset light was on his face and he looked, she thought, like a man who had made up his mind about something and was simply working out the words. "I have been doing survey work for 3 years," he said. "I am good at it, but there are other things I am good at and the survey work keeps me from them." He paused. "There is land available near Caldwell. I have been looking at a parcel about 4 miles south near the creek. It would support a small spread. I have enough saved to make a start." She looked at him, and her heart was doing something she was not going to examine too closely. "That is a significant decision," she said carefully. "It is," he said. "I am not a man who makes them quickly." "Neither am I," she said. He met her eyes. "I know," he said. "I did not expect you to." She drew a breath of that warm evening air, full of cattle dust and prairie grass and the distant wood smoke of cooking fires. "Are you telling me this because you want my opinion on the land market near Caldwell?" she asked. "Or because you want to know if there is a reason to be here?" "Both," he said. "They are connected. The land 4 miles south is good land," she said. "The creek is reliable. The grass is strong. It would support cattle and maybe a few horses." She looked at him. "And there is a reason." The words came out steadier than she had expected them to, but she found she meant them without reservation, which was how she had always needed to mean something before she could say it. He exhaled slowly, and the tension he had been carrying in his shoulders, so small she had only noticed it in its leaving, went out of him. "Then I will not take the Cimarron contract," he said. "You should be sure," she said. "I am not an easy proposition." "No," he said, and the ghost of that warm smile was there. "You are a complicated one." "You have been warned," she said, with a look that dared him to back down. "Difficult suits me fine," he said simply, and that was that. It was not a sudden thing after that. That was not the nature of either of them. But it was a real thing, and it grew the way real things grow, steadily and with good roots. He turned down the Cimarron contract and sent back his regrets to the land company in Dodge City, and he rode out to look at the parcel of land south of town and came back and reported what he found. 80 acres, fair water, a soddy in poor repair that could be rebuilt, grass enough for a modest start. He put in an offer to the land office, which at the time operated out of a 2-room office on the edge of town, and the offer was accepted. and Orville Hadley became a landholder in Sumner County, Kansas on a day in late May that was bright and clear and smelled of rain coming from the north. He came into the store to tell her, and she was in the middle of a delivery dispute with a Wichita freighter who had brought half the order she had paid for and seemed to expect to be paid for the whole thing. Orville took one look at the situation and quietly took up position at the far end of the counter and waited, and she handled the freighter with a precision and a controlled fury that resolved the dispute entirely in her favor within 8 minutes. And when the freighter left, she turned to Orville, and he was looking at her with an expression that she could only describe as openly admiring. "You are something else," he said. "I am a businesswoman who was shorted a quarter load of flour and dry goods," she said crisply, but the heat in her face was not entirely from the confrontation. "Both things can be true," he said, which was what he said when she tried to be only one thing. She straightened her apron and said, with something that was almost shyness and almost wasn't, "You have news." "The land is mine," he said. She smiled, and it was not a polite smile or a customer's smile but a real one, the kind she gave very rarely and that transformed her face in a way that only the people closest to her ever saw, and Nara, who was pretending to be completely absorbed in a crate of goods in the corner, smiled privately at the crate and did not say a word. The summer of 1878 was busy and hot and full. Orville was at work on the land south of town, rebuilding the soddy with the help of 2 hands he hired and 2 of his own capable pair, and he came into town twice a week, always on Tuesdays and Fridays, and on Fridays he and Irene ate supper together, sometimes at the small hotel dining room that was Caldwell's nearest thing to a restaurant, and sometimes at her table in the back of the store. And they talked with the ease of 2 people who had decided that talking honestly was worth the risk. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. A town the size of Caldwell noticed everything and had opinions about all of it, and the opinions about Orville Hadley keeping company with Irene Bell were wide and varied. Some men assumed he was a fool who didn't know what he was getting into. Some assumed he would be put in his place eventually, and then he would understand what they had all understood. A few women who liked Irene quietly, because she was fair even if she was sharp, thought it was about time someone had the sense to see what was there. Gus Waverly told anyone who would listen at the Long Branch Saloon that Hadley must be soft in the head, and that he would come around. One of the younger cowboys who worked Waverly's drive, a boy of maybe 22 named Eddie, said that he didn't think Hadley looked soft in the head, and Waverly told him to mind his business, and Eddie minded his business but kept his opinion. Nobody said anything to Orville directly, which was partly because he had a quality of quiet self-possession that made men thoughtful about whether they wanted to poke at it, and partly because he was already becoming known as a man who did what he said and said what he meant, and that was a currency that bought a certain amount of social peace. One evening in July, the 2 of them were walking back from supper at the hotel, the night air warm and thick with summer, when they passed 2 men outside the saloon who said something as they passed, something low and knowing, the kind of thing that is meant to be just barely audible. Irene heard it. She had spent her whole life hearing things like it, and she kept walking with her spine straight and her chin level because she was experienced at not letting it show. But Orville stopped. He turned around, without heat, without posturing, and looked at the 2 men with a steady regard that had the effect of extremely still water has on people, the unsettling clarity of it. "Excuse me," he said simply and politely. The 2 men looked at each other. "The lady did not appreciate that," Orville said, "and neither did I. I would take it as a courtesy if it did not happen again." There was a moment of silence that considered several possible futures, and then chose the quietest one, because something in the gray stillness of Orville Hadley's eyes made all of them feel that the other futures were inadvisable. "Meant no harm," one of the men muttered. "Good," said Orville, and turned back, and they walked on. Irene did not say anything for half a block. Then she said, "You did not have to do that." "I know," he said. "I have been handling that kind of thing for years on my own." "I know that too," he said. You are very capable at handling it, but that does not mean I want to stand beside you and do nothing." He looked at her in the dark. "I am not suggesting you need defending. I am saying that when someone speaks to you that way, it is an offense to me personally, and I would like to be permitted to say so." She was quiet again. "That is a different thing," she said finally. "Yes," he said. She considered it. It was, she decided, actually different. Not a man managing a situation he believed she could not manage, but a man telling her that her dignity mattered to him. Those were not the same. "All right," she said. He nodded. They walked on. Their hands found each other in the dark of the summer street without either of them making a production of it, and they walked the rest of the way like that, and it was the first time since she was perhaps 12 years old that Irene Bell had held someone's hand in the street. August brought trouble, as August in a cattle town often did. A man named Caleb Shores arrived in Caldwell with a business proposition and a wagon full of cheap dry goods, and within a week he had set up a temporary stall at the south end of Main Street, selling goods at prices that were below wholesale by enough to attract attention. Irene recognized immediately what it was: a price-cutting play designed to run her out of business and then raise prices once her store was gone. It was not an uncommon tactic, and it was not illegal, but it was damaging, and within 2 weeks she could see the difference in her daily totals. She did not panic. She sat down with her ledger and her pencil, and she worked the numbers until she found the places where she could hold, the items she could discount without running at a loss, the reliable customers whose loyalty she had earned over years, and the items Shores did not carry because they required relationships with suppliers she had built over a decade. She circled those items, and she held her prices where she could and discounted strategically where she had to, and she did not sleep as well as usual, but she did not make a single decision in fear. She told Orville about it on a Friday evening, sitting at her table with the account spread between them, explaining it not because she needed him to solve it, but because he had become the person she thought out loud with, which was its own remarkable development. He listened completely. He asked 3 questions, all of them practical and to the point. Then he said, "What do you need from me, if anything?" She appreciated the precision of that, not an assumption that he should fix it. A genuine question. "Nothing from you directly," she said, "but you know the ranch hands coming through, the drive workers. If you were willing to put in a word that the Bell store has better quality and established supplier relationships that would reach people Shores is targeting." "Done," he said without drama. He did it too. He told people honestly, in the way he told people things, that in his experience the Bell store was reliable and well-stocked, and that the woman who ran it knew her business better than anyone in the county. He said it to trail hands and ranchers, and he said it to Abner Cross and 2 cattlemen from Texas he met at the Long Branch Saloon one evening, and the words traveled the way true things travel, efficiently and without embellishment. By September, Caleb Shores had moved his operation north to another town, having found Caldwell less hospitable than anticipated. Irene sat with her balanced ledger on a September evening and felt the satisfaction of a battle won on her own terms, and then she looked across the table at Orville, who was examining a new survey map he was making of the local water sources purely for his own interest, and she thought something she had never thought about a man before, that having him there made the winning better. The soddy was finished by the end of September. It was a proper structure by then, not just the repaired soddy but an expanded version of it, with a real wooden front room that Orville had framed himself, a good chimney, a root cellar, and a barn in progress to the east. It was not grand. It was solid and practical, and it smelled of fresh lumber and earth, and when Orville showed it to her on a bright September afternoon, she walked through it with her hands clasped behind her and her eyes taking in every detail. "What do you think?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that was not quite casual, a care for her opinion that went beyond pride of workmanship. She stood in the front room with the afternoon light coming through the single window and looked at the clean lines of it, the careful joint work, the level floor. "I think," she said, "that whoever built this did not cut corners." "It is meant to last," he said. She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway with the September light behind him, and his expression had that careful, open quality it got when he was about to say something real. "It is meant for a life," he said. "A full one, the kind that has someone in it." She looked at him for a long moment. The something inside her that had opened by fractions over these months was very fully open now, and she was surprised to find it did not feel as frightening as she had always thought it would. "Are you asking me something?" She said. "I am," he said. "When you are ready at whatever pace suits you, but I am asking." She walked toward him across the new wooden floor of the room he had built for a life and stopped close enough that she could see the gray of his eyes very clearly. "I have never done this before," she said. "Not genuinely, not with someone I genuinely wanted." "Neither have I," he said. "Not genuinely." "I am not going to become someone smaller," she said. "I don't want someone smaller," he said. "I want you, exactly as you are." She breathed in the scent of new lumber and the faint smell of his duster and the prairie air coming through the open door. "Then ask me properly," she said. He did. He did not have a ring yet, because he wanted her to have a say in that, because he understood that she would want a say in it, and he thought to think of that, which told her everything she needed to know about him. He asked her with the simple, direct language that was all he had and all he needed, standing in the doorway of a house he had built with his hands, and she said yes with the simple, direct certainty that was all she had and all she needed. He kissed her for the first time there in the doorway, with the September Kansas light pouring around them and the prairie stretching out beyond, and it was the kind of kiss that feels like something settling into its right place after a long time in transit. The town of Caldwell had opinions about the engagement, naturally. Sheriff Dunbar said he supposed Hadley knew what he was taking on. The statement was not intended kindly, but Irene, when it was relayed to her by the postmistress who relayed everything, found she cared considerably less than she once would have. She had lived her whole life in the opinion of this town and she had survived it, and now she had something better to put her attention on. Nara, who had never been one for large expressions, hugged her once fiercely and then went back to work. Abner Cross wept a little, the way very old men sometimes cry at good news, because it reminded them of the whole arc of things. The women who had quietly liked Irene brought her things. One brought a quilt. One brought a recipe for a spice cake that had been in her family for a generation. One brought a length of good calico that was better than anything in the store's current inventory, in a deep blue that matched, she said, the color of Irene's eyes, which were not blue but dark brown, but it was the thought that sat warmly in Irene's chest for the rest of the day. They were married in November, which was Irene's choice because she had always liked November, the clean, spare beauty of it, the way the land lay quiet before winter. They were married by the circuit judge who came through Caldwell on his quarterly rounds, because Irene did not belong to the church, and the judge was sufficient in law, which was the kind of thing that gave the religious element of Caldwell something to murmur about, and which she did not lose a single moment of sleep over. The ceremony was small, held in Abner Cross's parlor because he had asked to host it, and because he had the nicest parlor available. Nara was there, and two of the ranch hands Orville had worked with who had become something close to friends, a lean, laconic man named Webb who chewed tobacco incessantly, and a younger man named Daniel who played the fiddle and played it beautifully, and Abner Cross himself in his Sunday coat with his watering eyes and his broad smile. Irene wore the deep blue calico made into a dress she had sewn herself in the weeks before the wedding, and she wore her hair down for the first time in public in longer than she could recall. And when Orville saw her come through Abner Cross's parlor door, he looked at her with an expression that she would carry inside her for the rest of her life, pure and uncomplicated joy. The expression of a man who could not quite believe his luck and was not trying to hide it. They said their vows with the window behind them showing the bare November trees and the gray sky. And the judge, who had seen a great many things in his years on the circuit, said afterward that it was the most honest set of vows he could remember hearing, and he meant it as a compliment. Daniel played the fiddle for an hour afterward, and they ate the food that various women of the town had sent over, more than enough to feed twice the people present. And Abner Cross told the story of helping with the survey maps 3 times, and it was a better story each time. And Webb said about 4 words total and seemed entirely content. When Orville and Irene drove south in the wagon in the early evening, with the temperature dropping and the first promise of winter in the air, she sat beside him with his coat pulled over her shoulders and his arm around her, and she thought that she had been right to wait for something that felt like this. Not rescue, not surrender, something mutual and solid and entirely chosen. They arrived at the house he had built, and she had helped furnish on her Wednesdays off, with pieces she had found and bargained for, and arranged with the precision of a woman who had opinions about where things belonged. And they lit the lamp and the fireplace, and they were home. The first winter of their marriage was cold the way Kansas winters were cold, thoroughly and without apology, and they were in it together. The store remained hers. This had been discussed and decided before the wedding, because Irene was not a woman who left important things undiscussed. The store was her business, her inheritance, the thing she had built from her father's foundation into something that was fully and recognizably hers, and she would continue to operate it exactly as she had operated it, with all authority and all profit belonging to her. Orville had agreed with the clean simplicity of a man who had never considered it otherwise. He had his land and his cattle operation to build. She had the store. They were 2 people with 2 purposes and 1 life. He drove her in every morning on the days the weather allowed, the 4 miles from the house to town, and he drove her home in the evenings. On the days he could not come, she drove herself in the wagon or on Clarence the mule, who was old and opinionated and liked her better than he liked most people, which she took as a referendum of considerable accuracy on human character. They argued sometimes, not bitterly, but with the real friction of 2 people with strong convictions occasionally pointed in different directions. Once about money, once about a decision she made regarding the store's credit policy that he thought was too generous, and that turned out to be exactly right. Once about whether to accept an invitation to a Christmas dinner at a nearby ranch where she found the host's wife condescending, and he found the host's knowledge of local water sources valuable. They argued with words and came to conclusions, and the conclusions stuck, because neither of them was interested in winning more than they were interested in being right, and they had both spent enough time alone to understand that being right required listening first. The cattle he had started with were a small herd, 12 head purchased with careful savings, Hereford cross stock chosen for hardiness. He worked the land with the same thorough attention he had brought to survey work, understanding it, reading its patterns, making decisions that were slow and considered rather than fast and flashy. By spring, the herd had increased and the barn was completed, and there were 2 horses in addition to the gray, one a working stock horse and one a gentle bay that he told her was hers if she wanted her. She wanted her. She named the horse Perdita, which was from a play she had read in her father's library, and Orville did not question the name, only asked what the play was about, and she told him, and they talked about it over supper that night, which was one of the varieties of happiness she had not expected from marriage, the simple continuity of interesting conversation. Spring of 1879 brought changes to Caldwell and to their lives in equal measure. The cattle drives were larger than the year before, the Kishom Trail running heavy and the town in full boom noise. Irene expanded the store's inventory to meet the traffic, taking on a new line of goods she had been considering for 2 years, and finally had the capital to attempt better quality tools and hardware than had previously been available in Caldwell, sourced from a Sheffield supplier in Kansas City who had been recommended by a customer, and who turned out to offer exactly the quality she was looking for. The new line was a success from the first week. She also hired a second person in the store, a young man named Samuel who was 17 and working toward 18, and who had been doing odd jobs around town with a thoroughness that impressed her. She trained him the way her father had trained her, carefully and with complete information, because she believed that a person who understood what they were doing and why would always do it better than a person who was just following orders. Nara, who had worked with Irene for 3 years by this point, and who had become something more than an employee, and more than she would have called a friend in the old careful way she had used that word, but something in the territory of genuine mutual regard and trust, told Irene in the spring of 1879 that her family had made a decision to travel south and west, following a route that others from her community were taking, and that she would need to leave the store by summer. Irene sat with this for a moment. "Is this what you want?" she asked. Nara said it was where her family was going, and family was not a separate thing from want. Irene nodded. She understood that, in the specific way of a person who had built a life on the foundation a father laid. She did not try to convince Nara to stay. She paid her through summer, all 3 months before the summer even arrived, and she gave her a reference that said precisely and honestly what kind of worker and what kind of person Nara was, because references could travel and you never knew when a piece of paper with the right words on it might open a necessary door. She told Orville about it that evening, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "She is a good person." "Yes," Irene said. "The world should be easier for good people," he said. "Yes," she said again, and she meant it in the specific way that acknowledged both the truth and the injustice contained in it, because the world in 1879 was not built to be easy for Nara, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was able to fix it by themselves, which was its own kind of weight to carry. Nara left in June with her family, and Irene trained Samuel to take on more responsibility, and she hired a woman named Clara, who was 23 and recently widowed and needed work, and who turned out to have a natural gift for organization that made the back room of the store more efficiently organized than it had ever been. In the summer of 1879, Irene discovered that she was expecting. She told Orville on a warm evening in August, standing in the kitchen of their house with the window open and the smell of summer grass coming through. She told him directly, the way she told him everything, without preamble or softening. He put down the coffee cup he was holding and looked at her for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her and held her carefully, as if something had shifted in the particular gravity of his world. "Are you all right?" he asked, against her hair. "I think so," she said, and it was honest because she was not entirely sure, because she had not allowed herself to think about this possibility in concrete terms, and now it was concrete and she was taking her own measure. "Are you frightened?" he asked. She thought about it. "Some," she said, "less than I expected to be." He held her for a while in the summer kitchen, and outside the window the prairie was going gold in the late light, and she thought that her father would have been very happy, and the thought was both sad and good, the way thoughts about the dead who loved you tend to be. The pregnancy proceeded as pregnancies in that time and place proceeded, with the care available in Caldwell in 1879, which meant the doctor who came through on his rounds and the practical knowledge of several women in town who had lived this experience many times over. Irene was not a woman who was going to be managed by anxiety, and she continued to run the store until November, when the physical reality of her situation made the full day behind the counter impractical, at which point she did her accounts from home 3 days a week and came in 2 days a week and trusted Samuel and Clara to carry the rest. Orville adapted everything around her without making a fuss of it. He was there in the practical ways that mattered. He drove her when she needed driving. He cooked when she could not face cooking. He did not tell her what she should or shouldn't do, and when she was frightened in the nights he was awake beside her, and that was sufficient. Their son was born in January of 1880, in the house south of Caldwell, delivered by the doctor and attended by a woman named Mrs. Jarity, who had helped bring half the children of Caldwell into the world, and who had a manner of complete competence that was, Irene decided, the most comforting thing about the entire ordeal. Orville was allowed in at the end, in time to see his son arrive, and Irene watched his face in the moment of it and thought that it was not a thing she would be able to put into words, that expression, but it was something she would carry for the rest of her life alongside the other moments she had catalogued and kept. They named the boy Thomas for her father. Thomas Bell Hadley, born January 1880, in a house on the Kansas prairie built by his father's hands 4 miles south of a cattle town on the Kishom Trail. He was a loud, determined, hungry baby who from the beginning appeared to have opinions about everything, which Orville said with considerable warmth was from her side of things, and she said was at least half from his, and they argued about it in the mild, fond way they argued about things that didn't matter and probably never resolved. The spring of 1880 was the spring that Caldwell grew and changed. The railroad push that had been coming for years pushed through in a serious way, and the town expanded, and new businesses arrived, and new people arrived with them. Some of the new people were good and some were not, which was the mathematics of any growth, and the town worked through the adjustments with varying degrees of grace. Sheriff Dunbar retired in the fall of 1880, and a new sheriff was appointed, a man named Isaac Blythe, who had come from a town in Colorado, and who was sharper and more even-handed than Dunbar had been, and who made a point of introducing himself to Irene on his first week in town, with a respect that she received at face value, and that turned out to be genuine. Irene expanded the store again in 1881, knocking through a wall to incorporate the small, empty building next door that the previous occupant had finally vacated. The new space became a proper hardware section, and she brought in a man with carpentry experience to help Samuel manage it, because she understood that expanding well meant expanding with the right people rather than just expanding fast. Orville's herd had grown to 40 head by the spring of 1881, and he had hired a permanent ranch hand, the young man Eddie who had once worked Waverly's drives and who had moved on from that employment, and found that Orville Hadley's operation suited his temperament and his ethics considerably better. Eddie turned out to be a good worker and a good horseman, and eventually someone they both thought of with real warmth, the kind of loyalty that grows from being treated fairly over a long time. Thomas, at 14 months, was walking into everything with the confidence of a boy who did not yet understand danger, which kept both his parents in a state of pleasant vigilance that they took turns at. In the evenings, after Thomas was in his bed and the house was quiet, they sat together in the way they had always sat together, with books or with talk or with the comfortable silence that required nothing of anyone, and Irene thought sometimes that this was the thing she had not known how to want before she had it. Not the specific peace of having no demands, but the specific peace of having this particular person in the same room. She had been considered difficult by every man in this town, and she was still herself, still sharp and still proud and still completely without interest in being otherwise. But she was also this, a woman sitting in the warm light of a good lamp in a house that held her life, with the sound of her sleeping son down the hall and the man she loved reading by the fire. Both things were true. Both had always been possible. In 1882, she found out she was expecting again, and this time she was less frightened and more plainly happy about it, which seemed like a reasonable progression. Orville took her out to see the land on a spring morning, the two of them riding out on horseback with Thomas on a lead rope on his own small pony, a fat-bellied gray that Eddie had found, and that the boy loved with the whole unreserved heart of a child, and they rode out to the far eastern edge of the property where the creek ran and the cottonwoods were just coming into leaf. "I have been thinking about this section," Orville said, stopping the gray and looking out at the water and the trees. "What about it?" she asked. "It would make a good spot for a kitchen garden," he said. "A real one, not the patch by the house. Good water access, good shelter from the west wind." He glanced at her. "If you had time for it. I know the store takes the day." She looked at the creek and the cottonwoods and the soft green coming into everything and thought about a kitchen garden, about growing things from the ground up, which was something she had always theoretically wanted and never had space for. "Clara and Samuel can manage Tuesdays and Wednesdays without me," she said. "I have been thinking of changing my schedule." She looked at him. "This is my land too." "Yes," he said simply. "It is." Thomas called out from his pony, because the pony had stopped and he wanted it to move, and they both looked at their son, this loud, determined small person who had arrived and rearranged the landscape of everything, and they smiled at each other over his head. She planted the kitchen garden in May of 1882 and tended it on Tuesdays and Wednesdays with a systematic attention that produced results by July that she found quietly astonishing. The way the ground responds when you give it what it needs. Their daughter was born in October of 1882, in the same house and with the same Mrs. Jarity attending, and she arrived in the world as loudly and determinedly as her brother had, which the doctor said was a good sign, which Orville said was thoroughly expected, which Irene said was entirely beside the point, and would someone please bring her the baby. They named her Clara June Hadley, Clara for the woman who had taken such good care of the store in the months of Irene's first pregnancy, and who had become genuinely important to her, and June for the month the kitchen garden had first produced, which was the kind of reason that made complete sense to both of them and would have seemed eccentric to anyone else. Clara June was dark-haired and gray-eyed, which was Orville, and she had the expression from her first week of life of a person who was paying very close attention to everything, which was both her parents. Thomas was 2 years and 9 months old when his sister arrived, and he regarded her with the intense, slightly suspicious interest of a small person encountering something that had not been there before and was now apparently permanent. Within a week, he had decided she was acceptable. Within a month, he had decided she was his, which she was, and which she would spend the rest of her childhood making sure he knew went both ways. Orville's cattle operation had reached the point, by the end of 1882, where it was producing a real and reliable income, and Eddie had been joined by another hand, a quiet man from New Mexico Territory named Diego, who had a gift with horses that approached the supernatural, and who had found his way to Sumner County, by a series of events that Diego told in a way that was funny and complicated and probably mostly true. The Bell General Store in 1882 was the largest and most complete dry goods and hardware operation in Caldwell, and its reputation had traveled far enough south along the trail that people who came through on drives specifically mentioned it as a reliable stop. Irene had done this. She had built this from a store her father had left her, and she had made it more than he had made it, not because his version was insufficient but because her version was hers. She sat with this knowledge one December evening, with Clara June asleep in the cradle near the fire and Thomas asleep down the hall and Orville reading at the table, and she felt it settle into her, the full weight of what she had made of herself, and it was a good weight, the kind that comes from things that actually belong to you. She looked at Orville across the table. "Orville," she said. He looked up from his book. "I am very glad you stayed," she said. He looked at her, and his face did the thing it did sometimes, went very open and very warm in a way that was private and entirely for her. "So am I," he said. He put his book down and moved to sit beside her, and they sat together in the firelight with their children sleeping in the house around them. And outside the December wind moved over the Kansas prairie with its cold, clean authority, and the house held against it, the way houses built by careful hands are supposed to hold. In the years that followed, the story did not simplify, because life in Caldwell, Kansas in the 1880s was not a simple thing, but it remained, at its center, the story of two people who had chosen each other well. Thomas grew into a boy who was quick and serious and interested in everything, who spent his Saturdays alternately helping in the store with his mother and riding the property with his father, learning both things with equal enthusiasm, and who, by the age of 7, had opinions about cattle breeding and accounting that were not yet sophisticated, but were already unmistakably his own. Clara June grew into a girl who was watchful and then suddenly not, who would go very still and quiet taking in a situation, and then move into it with a decisiveness that made Orville shake his head and Irene recognize herself and feel the specific satisfaction of watching something continue. Irene taught them both in the evenings, the way her father had taught her, with books and with questions, and with the fundamental belief that there was no such thing as a child who was not worth teaching carefully. She taught them mathematics and reading, and she taught them history, including the parts of history that were uncomfortable, because she believed that discomfort was often where the real learning was. Orville read with them and argued with them and took them out onto the land to learn what the land could teach, which was a different curriculum than the books but not a lesser one. The Bell General Store changed its sign in 1883, not in its name but in its appearance. Irene had a sign painter from Wichita come through and paint it fresh, the letters cleaner and larger, because the old sign had faded and she wanted people to be able to read it from further down the street. The painter did fine work and was genuinely pleased to do it, and when he finished, she paid him what he asked plus extra, because the work was worth more than he had asked, and she had never believed in underpaying good work just because you could get away with it. Abner Cross died in the winter of 1883, in his own bed in his white house with the green shutters, at the age of 81, which was a full life by any measure. He had spent his last months in good spirits, visited frequently by both of them, and he had made Orville promise to preserve the survey notes, which Orville did, binding them properly and keeping them in the house in a cedar box made for the purpose. At the burial, Irene stood at the graveside in the cold and she thought about all the things the old man had been: a friend to her father, a guide to her husband, a keeper of the knowledge of the land. She thought about how knowledge traveled, from person to person, in the notes and the conversations and the small repairs and the afternoon teas, and she thought that the thing about a good life was how much of it went on after the person was gone. In the spring of 1884, Gus Waverly, who had been one of the loudest voices in the years before about Irene being difficult, and Orville being soft in the head for pursuing her, came into the Bell General Store on a Thursday with a problem. His books were wrong. His foreman had left in the fall and had apparently not understood the accounting system he had been given, and the result was a winter's worth of records that did not balance and a spring roundup approaching that required knowing exactly what he had. He stood at the counter and explained this to Irene with the awkward dignity of a man who was accustomed to being large in a situation and had found himself small. She looked at him for a moment. She could have sent him away. She could have reminded him of every time he had sat at the Long Branch Saloon and told men that she was too difficult to deal with. She could have been every inch the cold, proud woman he had always said she was. She did not. "Bring me the ledgers," she said. "I will have a look." He brought them. It took her 2 days of Wednesday work to untangle it, and she charged him a fair professional rate for the time, which he paid without argument, and when she handed him back the corrected books she did not add commentary. She just gave him the work. He looked at the books and then at her. "Thank you," he said. It cost him something, she could see that. "It is what I do," she said simply. He left, and she thought that was probably the whole story, but a week later he sent over a crate of peaches from his trees, which did not grow well at their latitude but he had cultivated for years, the best peaches in the county. No note, just the crate. She made preserves. She gave 1 jar to Clara and 1 to Samuel and kept the rest. She did not tell Orville until that evening, and when she told him, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You could have turned him away." Yes, she said. Why didn't you? She thought about it. Because he came, she said. It costs something to come to someone you have treated poorly and ask for their help. He came anyway. I think that has to count for something. Orville looked at her across the supper table with that open, warm expression, the one that was entirely hers. You are a better person than you let people think, he said. Do not spread that around, she said. I have a reputation to maintain. He laughed, and it was the easy, genuine laugh of a man who was happy, and she smiled at him over the table in the lamplight, and the children were making noise in the back room, and the house was full of them. The end of the 1880s brought the railroad fully into Caldwell's life, and with it everything that followed, the cattle trade shifting and changing, new people and new money and new problems. And through all of it, the Bell General Store adapted, and the Hadley Ranch adapted, because both of them were run by people who understood that the only fixed thing in the West was change itself. Thomas, by the time he was 9, had made it clear that he intended to know everything about both the store and the ranch, and that he saw no reason why these should be separate knowledges, which was so specifically his parents' logic that both of them privately felt the pleasure of watching it reproduced. Clara June, at 7, had made it clear that she was going to do things her way, which her parents also found specifically familiar, and her father said once, quietly, to her mother, that he thought she was going to be quite something, and Irene said she was already quite something, which was simply the accurate accounting of an actual fact. On an evening in late September of 1887, Irene and Orville sat on the porch of their house in the cooling air, with the first hints of autumn in the sky, and the sound of the children inside at their books. And they sat the way they had always sat, with the comfortable ease of two people who had spent enough time together to know that silence between them was not empty. The prairie spread out ahead of them, going gold and amber in the evening light, the long grass moving in the wind, the cottonwoods along the creek showing the first yellow of their turn. A hawk moved in wide circles over the southern pasture. The cattle were settled for the evening, the horses in the barn, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Do you ever miss it? She asked. The survey work moving through. He considered it seriously, the way he considered things. Sometimes, he said, I miss the particular quiet of it, the way the land looks when there is no one else in it. He looked at her. But I don't miss it the way I would miss this if I didn't have it. What do you miss most about it? The sky at night away from town, the way you can see everything. He paused. Though we see it here well enough. She looked at the sky, which was going rose and gold now, extravagant in the way Kansas autumn skies could be. My father used to say that the trouble with wanting a big life was you had to be willing to live it, she said. I didn't understand what he meant for a long time. What did you come to think he meant? That it is easy to want things in the abstract, she said. It is harder to be present for them when they are actually happening. To not be somewhere else in your head, preparing for what comes next, instead of being in what is right now. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the prairie. Are you present? He asked. She looked at him, this man she had chosen and who had chosen her, on the porch of the house he had built for the life they had made together, in the sound of their children's voices and the smell of the prairie evening. Yes, she said. I am very present. He took her hand, the way they had first held hands in the dark of that summer street, and they sat together in the September evening and watched the light go out of the sky slowly, the colors deepening and then fading to the deep blue that precedes the stars. And then the stars came out over the Kansas prairie, the way they had come out every evening of their lives, vast and clear and indifferent to human concern, and somehow, paradoxically, exactly what human hearts needed to see. Inside the house, Thomas and Clara June argued briefly about something involving a book, resolved it the way they generally resolved things, with a brief negotiation and a verdict that satisfied no one entirely and both parties adequately, which was approximately justice, and settled back to their reading. Irene listened to them and felt the warmth of the lamp through the window at her back, and the cool of the evening on her face and Orville's hand in her hand. and she thought that the town of Caldwell had called her difficult, and they had not been wrong exactly, but they had been measuring the wrong thing. She was difficult in the way that good land is difficult, the way a real argument is difficult, the way anything worth anything requires you to rise to it. She had always been that, and she had always been right to be that, and the man beside her had known it from almost the beginning, which was what made him the right man. She had spent years waiting for someone who would not require her to be less, and he had ridden in on a gray horse with a cracked saddle and a list written in careful handwriting, and he had said difficult suits me fine, and he had meant every word. The prairie night settled in around them, full and quiet and enormous, the way the world out west tended to be, and the two of them sat in it and were home. In the years that followed, the town of Caldwell grew and changed and grew again, and the Bell General Store changed with it, and the Hadley Ranch expanded to 120 acres with a real herd and a reputation for good stock. And Thomas learned both, and Clara June learned both, and then both children eventually learned their own minds and made their own decisions, which was how their parents had raised them. Irene Bell Hadley ran her store for 22 years after her father had passed it to her, and when she finally brought Samuel in as a full partner in 1893, it was because the business had grown large enough to need two minds on it, and because Samuel had earned it by 15 years of absolute reliability and honest work, and because she wanted, in that last quarter of her life, to keep the part that was most essentially hers and let the rest be carried by someone she trusted. She kept her Wednesdays, and she kept her accounts, and she kept her opinions, and she kept her habit of wrapping things the way she would want them wrapped if she were the one carrying them, and she never once became anything other than what she had always been. Orville worked the land he had purchased on a May morning with money he had saved through years of careful work, and he knew every acre of it, and he built it into something that was modest and excellent and wholly real. And in the evenings he read, and in the mornings he rode the property, and in between he was present for his wife and his children with the particular attentive quality that had always been his, the quality of a man who understood that what was in front of you was the thing that mattered. They were not perfect people, and they had not a perfect marriage, because no such things exist in the real territory of human lives, but they had a true one, built on the bedrock of two people who had chosen each other with their whole, clear, honest selves, and that bedrock held. In the end, when Caldwell had grown old enough to have its own stories and its own legends, Irene Bell was among them. Not the way difficult women were usually remembered, as cautionary tales or unfortunate outcomes, but as a woman who had run a business and raised children and lived on the prairie and kept her own counsel, and who had done all of it exactly as she chose to do it, in a time when that was not easy for a woman, and had done it anyway because the alternative had never made a single particle of sense to her. And beside her in that legend, in the comfortable way of things that belong together, was a cowboy who had come through on a gray horse in the spring of 1878 and stayed forever, because the difficult woman on the main street of a cattle town in Kansas had turned out to be precisely and exactly everything he was looking for. And difficult, he had always said, suited him just fine. The wind moved over the Kansas prairie as it always had and would. The grass bent and recovered and bent again. The cottonwoods turned gold in the autumn and bare in the winter and green again in the spring. And the creek ran where it ran, and the stars came out at night as they always had. And under all of that and through all of that, the life that two careful, honest people had built together continued, warm and full and entirely real.